All right, everybody. Without any more ado here, as it were, I want to thank everybody for attending today. We just wanted to have a discussion as it related to your various options for upgrading to SharePoint 2010. And with us today, we have AvePoint, who is a valuable partner of ours, who can assist in these kinds of migrations. And what we hope to attempt as we go through today's webcast is to explore. There are a number of ways to approach your 07 to 010 upgrade. And AvePoint, we think, is a very valuable piece in particular business context that we'll get to shortly. All right, so just to begin with the beginning, as usual, about GigWorks. Our company began in 2002, so we're entering into really our 10th year of operation. We've been a Gold partner since we began, and we're field managed by Microsoft, sort of inside Microsoft community term, but the import of which is not a lot of folks get the privilege. Of the 12,000 partners in New York Metro, 24 are field managed, so we're in a rather small club. And what this means for our clients is that because we have this relationship with Microsoft, which is based upon our technical abilities and our customer satisfaction, we in fact get access to resources and training and such that other partners don't. And with that, and principally one of the big ones was, for instance, being invited to the Partner Evidence Program for SharePoint 2010. The net result being is that we've been working with SharePoint 2010 since May of 2009. So, and having training in the product as early as October, which gives us a good head start and able to bring that that knowledge to our customers. We won Best Technology Partner 2010, New York, New Jersey, with Microsoft for our work within SharePoint, and we've won a number of other awards over the years. Our competency in SharePoint, I don't know what co-location is because that's not what we do. Our competencies are in SharePoint and through extension business intelligence, infrastructure, and custom application development. It's SharePoint collaboration and portals. I'm sorry, there's a typo up on the screen. With AvePoint, Mary, if you would like to take it. Mary from AvePoint is joining us today.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much. So AvePoint is a software company, much like GigWorks specializes in the services and kind of helping people kind of get started with SharePoint and integrating the technology into their current infrastructures. And we help support SharePoint as an infrastructure platform. So we actually have our own platform and sit on top of SharePoint and do things like data protection, administration, obviously migration into SharePoint. That's what we're here to talk about today. But we've also been around pretty much since the beginning of SharePoint. We have a lot of global customers and global offices to really help provide another level of support that not a lot of people are able to provide their customers. It was a very large and very SharePoint-specific R&D team. So again, a sole focus on SharePoint. We kind of put a lot of stock in this basket. So with SharePoint success, we've been able to grow and establish good OEM relationships and also develop a close relationship with Microsoft as a depth managed partner. And we also work with the Microsoft Technology Centers. We've been top members of SharePoint 2010 as well. So we're a lot invested in SharePoint, and we're here to kind of help you succeed in your organizations with your SharePoint implementations. And so thanks so much, and I'll turn it back over to Joe, and let's get on with the presentation.
Sure. And and the quick thing to add is that GigWorks very much values our partners like AvePoint and the like, because one of the things that we think is a big advantage of SharePoint, and a lot of advantages of SharePoint, quite frankly, but one of which is that you have this rich community of third-party companies that can really assist in a variety of levels, and AvePoint has one of the most comprehensive toolkits as it relates to SharePoint augmentation in the industry. Talk a little bit about today's presentation. I'm Joe Gigrich. I'm waving fictitiously over here. I'm the managing partner and founder of GigWorks. With us is Mary Mackey, and she's the director of product marketing for AvePoint. In today's discussion, and I'm going to try to get through this stuff very quickly because we'll have all of an hour, and demos are usually what most folk really want to see. But very quickly, I just want to talk about SharePoint 2010 and as it relates to 07. Because quite frankly, upgrades are all well and good, but there has to be a business value to it. So I think we'd be remiss to talk about upgrades and the various strategies without at least quickly positioning the plethora of improvements that are related to the product. Talk briefly about the 2010 requirements, and then the options and the considerations and best practices, and of course demonstration. So, to begin with SharePoint 2007, for those of you who are currently using the product, my guess is most of the people registered and attended today are in fact in '07. If you've ever been pitched SharePoint at any point in your life, you've probably seen the wheel. And the 6 pillars, as it's referred to, really has always told a very good story about the product. And so it is a unique product set. I'm not trying to sell what's sold, but it is unique in that, unlike Documentum, which just does DMS, or Cognos, which just does BI, SharePoint on a single platform is able to reach across the 6 pillars of collaboration, portal, search, et cetera, and so forth. And it was a unique paradigm shift in platform and a huge opportunity for enterprises, the ability to standardize to a single platform and not only be able to get this Swiss Army knife going, but also, quite frankly, I've always argued that sum of the parts is greater than the whole, that to be able to pull into context, into a site, all the things that your particular business unit or research team or whatever has to deal with as it relates to document management and collaboration and searching on it and getting back metrics that are related to their endeavors, as well as integration of a lot of business systems, which is a big thing for us, is a huge and unique value proposition. So, the world being what it is, and particularly those of us in sales and marketing who need to make a living, lo and behold, we have a new 6 pillars with new names. And so I just want to quickly go through what the realignment of nomenclature really represents. This is the new 6 pillars as it relates to 2010. And to put them side by side, while there is some level of marketing rebranding, and not to disparage my own profession, if you will, there are actually some very key conceptual distinctions that have been made as it relates to the 6 pillars, and really do help tell the story of why you do want to upgrade. So, for instance, collaboration and portal have been stricken as nomenclature for good reason. The whole product is a collaborative portal, so I think that was sort of reasonable to go. And when you think about it, something like sites, for instance, is a more meaningful term. Is a more meaningful term as it relates to the product set, because it's through a site that you affect the subsummation of the 6 pillars. But to talk about some of the marked improvements, just very quickly, business process or business process automation, that pillar has been replaced by composites. It's a demonstrative improvement through the BCS, which has replaced the BDC. The BDC was Business Data Catalog. It's now been replaced with Business Connectivity Services. Quickly spoken, it is a tool to allow bidirectional integration with third-party line of business systems, to introduce data as metadata authoritatively, to mesh up into forms, to allow for a refresh of UI of that legacy system, and one of the demonstrative improvements inside the product. And going in no particular order, I'll go down to the left. Insights replaces business intelligence. And insights, again, is a reasonable form of repositioning of language to describe something which is to give data visualization, to bring insight to an organization, to give it some distinguishing characteristic as to traditional BI. Generally, when you think of BI, you're thinking of Cognos and 4 people in finance in your 2,000-seat institution who actually benefit. And one of the things that Microsoft has been very aware of is that BI delivered to the masses, so that everybody in sales and marketing and operations can get insight as to the metrics which rule their life, has enormous value for the institution, and Insights is demonstrably improved as well. Performance Point is much more tightly integrated, et cetera, and so forth. Moving right along to search, Microsoft acquired a company called Fast, as I speak fast. And Fast is a premier search engine out there. It's been brought into the SharePoint stack to bring in a number of things such as thumbnails and previews. And search has always been a missed opportunity, we believe, in a lot of institutions, in that search can be extended to go against your file systems, line of business systems, and has done nothing but improve. Content, or content management, is one of the 2 or 3 areas we would argue have had demonstrative improvement, in that pound for pound, we believe that the document management capabilities of SharePoint compete with every product out there. Multi-stage policy retention, as it relates to, if it's this kind of document, hold it this number of years. If it's this, then send it over there. This was lacking in the form of product. And through things like remote blob storage, the ability to have vast amounts of content inside SharePoint, but not stuck inside the SQL database, which is expensive, of which AvePoint also has a great tool set to accommodate this new feature, but for another webinar. And communities, which is a refresh and a demonstrative rebuild of My Sites. My Sites, interestingly, going back to 2001, really was the first social networking program, predating by a number of years things like Facebook now and MySpace before that, et cetera, and so forth. But it really hadn't kept up. And with this latest iteration, the ability to share and disseminate skills across the institution and collaborate with your colleagues within your own space, a very big value proposition as well. So there was a speed tour of what's changed in the product. Please do look onto our website for past webcasts and stuff, where we go into this stuff in detail, and as we continue to do that across the year. Come on, there we go. So let's talk a little bit about SharePoint 2010 requirements. Many of you probably already know this, but this is also a big improvement in the product set. Just to move around the slide, I don't like to read the magic because you can read that on your own. But pre-upgrade requirements, there's now a pre-upgrade checker. And this was a big improvement where it would do a health check against your environment, identify that, for instance, you're running it on a 32-bit box when now the requirement is 64-bit, things like this. And so the requirements around it are like all products. They increase over time. You really do want to run this on SQL 2008 R2. Even though you can go on to 05, it's through the implementation of 2008 R2 that you're going to be able to bring online the advantages of things like remote blob storage. Remote blob storage, again, being the ability to remove binary large objects out of the content database and stick it on cheaper storage, which allows you to scale to a much more robust system. And it's all 64-bit, and 64-bit has certainly arrived. I mean, all our desktops, frankly, at GigWorks are 64-bit. So the upgrade checker is there to run these diagnostics, identify where you have issues, and has widely facilitated upgrades. Now, you have, in terms of the options of moving to 2010, they fall into two major buckets, right? One is to do the in-place upgrade, and the other is to migrate. And there are different flavors of migration, and this is where most of the discussion will be around. And in all candor, we at GigWorks favor a straight-up upgrade the least. It's very high risk and the like, but we'll get into that in additional slides. One thing to underscore about the upgrade path, though, is that even though we don't think it's the best way to proceed for a few reasons that we'll get into, it is important to note that the fact that you can upgrade 2010, for those of you who went through the living hell of going from 03 to 07, should appreciate that Microsoft has gone a long way between this and the pre-upgrade check to make sure that moving to future iterations of SharePoint won't be as painful as they had been in the past. And in fact, the capability is there. Now, as to why you may want to do an in-place upgrade or a database attach upgrade and these various hybrids and combinations therein, as well as a full-on migration, which is what we'll get to with the AvePoint piece, really is driven by business case as much as anything else. And there's, like everything else in IT, it's the business case and that return on investment that drive that decision. And these are some of the determining factors. Downtime, business continuity, one of the great bugaboos of all upgrades of any system inside a shop. And arguably with SharePoint, one of the most dangerous ones, because SharePoint done right affects every user in the institution. And physical hardware, so again, this in-place upgrade is great if you're running all 64-bit metal on the latest and greatest. If you've been running SharePoint for a number of years, that is highly unlikely that you are. And customizations, right, and the ability to regression test and remediate. So in-place upgrade, number one, really does fail in many respects across these three key determining factors. And again, it's not that you can't do it. It's just that we think these three factors really start to push you much more into the direction of choices 2 through 5. Let's talk about an in-place upgrade. So just very quickly, theoretically, all your settings are preserved and customizations are available. The real downsides, though, have to do with the fact that you are now offline while this process is going. And it takes a very long time for this to run. And we would argue also that these customizations, it is more often than not that we run into institutions that go, oh, no, it's vanilla. only to find out that their in-house developers have injected DLLs directly into the GAC and have done tons of code behind in their forms, and for those of you who are non-technical on the call, just a lot of stuff that's going to break. And so to our mind, the in-place upgrade is the highest risk approach, and the one that we really just don't recommend as a general rule. The database attach upgrade. This is, in many respects, what we recommend to folks a good chunk of the time. And there's, the pros to this is you can upgrade multiple content databases at the same time. You can combine farms. You can rejigger the back end. And there are some other things about the upgrade, database attach upgrade. What we're talking about is standing up a new instance of SharePoint, typically in staging, copying over the content database, and letting that new instance of SharePoint upgrade the 07 content database. There are downsides to this as well, though. The customizations aren't upgraded, which the out-of-the-box ones should be, right? The ones that are custom, however, would break in under a circumstance. And you do have to manually redeploy WSPs and the like. Your customizations go bye-bye. And there is a great deal of overhead on network bandwidth as you move these databases around. And you're going to need a lot of new hardware. Now, again, if you are down the road of getting new hardware, the cons disappear. But again, it's the business case that drives all these kinds of decisions. And I do apologize if I'm rushing. It's just I would like to be done with the PowerPoint literally within the next 5 minutes. There are hybrid approaches, right, where you provide read-only access to the content during the upgrade process. We generally move more in this hybrid approach so that you have the ability during the cutover. We would argue generally that you want to do this in 2 stages anyway. You want to do this in a staging environment. And when you get to the actual cutover, this is where you're going into these hybrids. Because now that you've done your remediation, you've stood it up, you see what's going to break, you know how you're going to fix it, then you mark everything read-only and then move along. Minimal downtime. It is fast and in place, and it's just a lot less risky. And you do get to do the hardware piece, which is going to be essential, and the new platform. Very much believe that as you go into the new iteration of 2010, you're not serving your purpose as well if you don't really seriously consider moving to SQL 2008 R2 as your back end, again, because of remote blob storage or RBS. In place with detached databases, I guess this is actually the approach that, in retrospect, that we pushed the most. You still have the issue of moving copies of databases over the network. If you're on the LAN segment, it's one thing. If it's a WAN, it's a bit more. But again, you're going to be preserving and upgrading a lot of the farm settings, et cetera, and so forth. And I do just want to get into the demo as quickly as possible. There's alternate access mapping, redirection, so that you're doing chunks of your environment and just essentially tweaking your URL mappings so that it's seamless to the end user. Particularly if you have multiple site collections, this works very well. And then as you go into into your upgrade cycle, baseline considerations: the 32 to 64-bit need across the board, whether or not your hardware is going to does support 32 or 64. Yeah, upgrading an environment that uses forms-based authentication is non-trivial. The upgrading of very large databases. And this is going to start pushing us into where we really think AvePoint starts to come into play very aggressively, and we'll talk about that in a moment. And whether or not you're going from 03 to 07 first, et cetera, and so forth. So how many iterations of the upgrade are you going through? And this is all stuff that, as you go into formal planning, is considered with vendors such as ourselves or somebody else. Other considerations around upgrades have to do with the overall database size, the number of SharePoint objects, hardware, what the pre-upgrade checker has spit out as being potential issues, and what kind of space you're going to need on the go forward. Now, this is a summary of options for moving, and the third-party tools are where we start to see a lot of opportunities around a couple of key areas. One is business continuity. Certainly, if the existing environment is up and you're doing synchronous replication to another place, this works well. Also, I'd argue in combination with alternate URL mappings. And there's two big drivers that we think, or at least at GigWorks, and I'll let AvePoint speak for themselves, that we really think that the AvePoint tool really starts to come into play. For one, a lot of the SharePoint environments, 07 environments that we encountered over the years running in enterprises, there were a lot of missed opportunities. 07 came on like gangbusters, even though it was the third iteration of the product. It was by far the most successful. And a lot of SharePoint was stood up, even by our own case going back 6 years or so ago, by folks who otherwise had a .NET background and may or may not have understood the full potential of 07, or SharePoint itself, best practices, gotchas, all those kinds of things. And so with it, what we've seen with reasonable frequency and commonness, that's quite English, is a lot of missed opportunities as it related to SharePoint 07. That the content databases, for instance, are just too big. And so from a DR perspective and performance perspective, non-trivial. And splitting a content database is nothing you can actually do. So you end up having to rejigger across multiple site collections, where you're going to place data, et cetera, and so forth. Now, as soon as you get into the rejigger, and there's two basic reasons for a rejigger of your existing farm, is number one, you got a lot of stuff wrong. You didn't do metadata. You have file folders instead of well-attributed documents. The IA is wanting. We've gone into some places. You have navigation that goes left or right, like on 15 tabs. I mean, it grew like wildfire. A lot of SharePoint 07 was ungoverned, was stealth. IT booted it up. Next thing you know, 1,000 users are on it. There was no formal governance, et cetera, and so forth. And so you'll find that a number of users out there go, it's a great product, but God, if I had the chance to do it over again, if I had a chance to govern it, if I had a chance to revisit IA or metadata or the back-end size of the databases, there's a huge opportunity as you go into 2010 to take advantage not only of the incredible improvement in the product itself, again, particularly as it relates to composites and content management itself, but to also revisit the sins of the past. And this is, as all things in IT, you live and learn, and that's fine. And it's just nice that when you get to a new iteration, if you have the actual opportunity to fix what if you only had known then. And so with that, this is where I think it's a good jumping point for the demo. Mary, do you want me to do some of the other slides in the deck, or should we just go right for the demo? It is 1:27, so.
Yeah, I can. I'll buzz right through the demo, and then we'll let you wrap up with the slides before we get into Q&A. That sounds good.
Excellent. Okay, thank you, Mary.
Sure, and I'm just going to actually switch over and share my desktop so that you guys can see the .app interface, as well as the remote desktop that I have running in the background. Before, I'm just going to kind of up my color so you guys see all the gradients we have. And Joe, you guys just let me know if there are any issues or you're not seeing anything that I'm showing. But what everyone should see is the .app interface in my screen here. So again, I've just logged into a standard Internet Explorer browser window. So I just type in the server name and kind of .app, and up pops the screen. So it's browser-based in the sense that I can access this from anywhere, which especially comes in handy in migration projects, because we see a lot of times that you don't necessarily want to have to be on-site with your servers in the off hours that many of these migration projects will be completed over. So we give you a few options in that respect. Now, what I have here is I'm first going to go into my remote desktop and show you around a 2007 site collection. So here we have an administration site here. We've got some announcements, a calendar. I'm going to kind of buzz around and show you a little bit of the content that we currently have here. So you can get an idea of what all I'm looking to bring over into my 2010 environment. So I have images, I have documents, I have calendars, and actually let me go back up into my documents, because what we're going to do here is pay close attention to the metadata and the aspects of this content that we're able to carry over and when we're modifying things. And we have calendars with several recurring meetings, images, tasks, announcements. You can see I added a new announcement. I was testing out a few things the other day. And then I also have subsites through here. So this is kind of my site collection. I'm just going to buzz around to a couple different sites and show you basically we have a content management site with some shared documents over here and lists. And under the deployment manager site, we have more announcements, more documents, and all kinds of stuff like that. So when I pull up my doc app interface, essentially what I'm looking to do here is select content that I want to bring over, and then select an area on my 2010 farm where I want that site collection and subsites or pieces of that content to go. Now, again, just like Joe mentioned, some of the benefits that you'll see with third-party tools, unlike AvePoint's doc app migration solutions, is the ability to granularly select content. So we're not looking at an entire content database. You could have multiple site collections per database. We could even drill down and allow you to restructure Sharepoint as you go to maybe consolidate lists on various sites, or maybe consolidate sites throughout various site collections into a new 2010 site collection, if you're really looking to kind of restructure Sharepoint as you go. So what I've done here is actually set up a couple pre-created plans here. So you'll see I'm on a plan that's called Migrate 07 Admin, which is the site collection that we just browsed around. So it's got pretty basic options set here. No reporting, we just really ran this, and no scheduling, we just kind of ran this real time to get everything over. But basically what you see here is I've got my content selection for my source on the left. So at any time I would just select my 2007 farm, select my administration site here with all of the lists and libraries and announcements. And anytime I can browse in and see which pieces of content I have there. I have a couple of announcements. And then I also have the subsites. These are the announcements that I'm looking to bring over or have brought over. And I've also selected all my subsites here as well to bring over. Now, I can also select, so I want to take the opportunity to really refresh what my site structure is going to look like. I can always select only the top level sites and not bringing over lower level elements, and giving you a chance to rearrange that way. And then I just select my destination over here. So I've just selected, again, a destination site collection over here on the right in my 2010 farm, where that site will be moved to. So I have several options up here for filtering and mapping policies, and again, you saw the reporting and scheduling, but you do see this plan is already completed. So what I want to do first is show you the results of this plan, this very basic run plan that I've done, and then we'll kind of go back through and investigate some of the options that we give you to kind of dive into a little bit more detail and more control that you have to bring over specific elements. So this is what the 2010 site looks like. So there have been changes. This is kind of a main demo environment here at AvePoint. But we can see on the right here immediately we have the images that were brought over, shared documents that we see right here. And if we look at even the metadata of these documents, we're able to see that everything is brought over completely intact from my 2007 environment, metadata and everything. And that's one of the kind of very powerful capabilities, that this is completely non-disruptive to any business processes. You can see all the contents brought over with the appropriate metadata. And if I go back to the main site, I can continue to browse around, looking at different announcements. And again, some things have changed and modified here on the destination side. Some announcements have changed. If we go back to the main page, we can go to, let's see, we looked at the content manager site where we saw announcements and different document libraries. Deployment site, again, more announcements, more document libraries, and good stuff like that. Now, what I want to do, and one thing that we think is really powerful about this tool and its capabilities, is the ability to perform those incremental migrations, which essentially allow you to maintain platform coexistence. So with any tool, right, even a migration tool like DocApp that we consider pretty good quality, there are certain things we can bring over, certain customizations. We're beta testing a lot of support for workflows, very basic workflows, built-in workflows, but nonetheless to help maintain that consistency between environments. So what we've also realized is that during that post-upgrade or migration step, no matter what, you will have to go back and verify that content was brought over correctly, that permissions are still configured correctly. You might want to go run some reports to make sure that your environment's correct. You might want to do some, while it's in that kind of development farm, you want to go through and make sure that just everything is like you want it. You want to be able to set some times where you can rearrange and restructure sites if that's something that you want to do after you've completed the migration process. So again, allowing for that incremental migration does allow for that platform coexistence because we can migrate. And while you're checking, you can let your users still access your 2007 farm. And periodically, DocApp will just go back and look for changes. And no matter what content's been updated, we can actually incrementally migrate back to 2010 so that, again, that platform coexistence is maintained. And you can continue doing the work that you need to on SharePoint 2010 and perform the kind of rollout to users all at once or site collection by site collection or what have you, kind of according to your business objectives. So what I'm going to do now is just quickly add an announcement and then perform an incremental migration. And while we're going through some of the other options that I'm going to show you, I'll let this run in the background, and then we'll kind of look into the end and see that it completed. He's furiously typing in the background. So I've added this new announcement. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to DocApp, the DocApp interface, and actually I'm going to kind of preset up these incremental plans. I'm going to go back. You can see that I've included some different migration options, so I'm not overriding data here. I've included a start time, but I'm not really going to use that because I'm just going to run it now. But you see I've selected the same site collection, so this administration site on my destination side. And then once I let these tree structures expand, I'll actually go down and see I have the exact same destination over here on the right. And again, the migration settings and reporting and whatnot I've kept pretty basic. What I'm going to do is actually run this now, choose incremental options and not overwrite. And what I'm going to do is just give us a quick description so that I have job monitors. And anytime I can go back and check the status of this job, obviously this is much more valuable for plans that might include multiple site collections or really heavy content structures. So I'm actually running this plan on background. Now, while this plan is running, I'm actually going to take you through some of the options that we give you from a migration perspective. So if you look here on the left, you see that we give you the ability to kind of select all your site collections and webs on your 2007 side and move them over to 2010 all at once. And that's an option. But again, you're not really taking advantage of the capabilities of the granular content selection and scheduling options and things like that. So what you see up here in the migration settings, there are a lot of different links with filters and mapping setups and filter policies and how we want to handle archived data. So Joe mentioned earlier the RDS providers for 2010. Well, 2007 had an EBS provider that a couple vendors like AvePoint have actually also created blob providers to allow you to leverage. If you've leveraged EBS or AvePoint EBS providers in 2007, we give you the option to keep that content externalized instead of having to bring it back into your SQL databases before the migration happens. And then once you're in 2010, which also gives you the option to leverage EBS, the external blob storage provider, then we can allow you to migrate from EBS to RDS, if that's the kind of direction Microsoft wants us to go. So options there. I'm actually going to go into my settings and kind of show you some of those options that we talked about, that we saw right there. So basically, I have options to preserve look and feel of existing SharePoint sites, reset version numbers, keep all my permissions or only restore certain permissions, whether I want to migrate alerts, and if I need, obviously this is more important in things like file system migration, but we give you an option to, get rid of illegal characters. And in SharePoint specifically, there are maximum lengths of URLs that you're allowed to have, so making sure that those things are kind of abided by. And we also give you options to do domain mapping, so graphical domain mappings and user mappings, list level configuration. So some of those great features that we talked about with SharePoint 2010 are things like manage metadata, allowing you to have enterprise level taxonomies and term stores to provide kind of a whole other dimension to your SharePoint environment and really take advantage of those ECM type capabilities. And we allow you to rapidly deploy those features and take advantage of that functionality by allowing you to do things like change existing metadata in SharePoint 2007 and to manage metadata in SharePoint 2010 by allowing you to map into manage metadata columns. So for instance, on my old SharePoint sites, I had things like last modified time, but maybe I'd created custom columns or custom site columns even, and labeled those as contract IDs or case numbers if I'm a legal institution, or what have you. If I want to map those terms into managed metadata columns, I have the option to do that with .app. So not only are we helping you rapidly deploy SharePoint, but also rapidly get the best value out of SharePoint 2010 by allowing you to take advantage of those great features like managed metadata. Same thing on the site side, allowing you to map a site column into managed metadata. There's site template replace settings. In our user guide, we give you some template IDs and stuff like that. Content type mappings and all those things to make sure that when you're making a move, making a leap from 2007 to 2010, you're able to bring over exactly what you want and then have 2010 looking very closely to what the desired outcome is without having to go through and manually recreate everything. So enabling these mapping options are some of the very powerful capabilities that we give you. Now, pre-created domain mappings, we simply did a test domain mapping, testing 1 to 2. Now, something else that we really think is valuable and something that we leverage services partners a lot with is when you're going through and deciding which content is relevant to bring over into SharePoint 2010, and we give you filtering options to help kind of automate that process. A lot of times we'll have services partners recommend that you manually go through or send out surveys and have people verify that content is still needed in the next version of SharePoint. And what we can do is actually help automate this process. So we can help you select content based on created time or modified time, or versioning the document, so you're not really bringing over a lot of old stuff, all the stuff in the attic or what have you. We allow you to filter and get focused on what's necessary to be in the latest version of SharePoint. So I have a couple of test filters set up where we've migrated only 1 year of data. So data within 65 days, it's modified within 65 days. And I could also do something like created time. Then I also have an option here where I can migrate the 5 versions only. So you can see this is unchecked from the time range standpoint. But when I go over to versions, I only want to keep the latest 5 versions in that migration. I only want to migrate the latest 5 versions. So this really helps hone down on which content is going to be relevant to bring into SharePoint 2010. So let me actually go back to my plan. I'm going to see if my plan here is completed. And it looks like it just might have. So now I'm actually going to go back over and hope this works. Remember, we added an announcement and an incremental migration plan. So now I'm just going to go back into administration, go back into announcements. And yeah, absolutely. So we brought over that new announcement and that incremental migration with that incremental migration plan, maintaining that same modified date and time that we're demoing migration with GigWorks. So again, just to kind of showcase the capabilities that we allow you to keep and maintain that coexistence of different platforms. Obviously, there are a lot of other options that we give you and a lot of powerful capabilities. And bottom line is, with our 10 years of SharePoint experience and with great partners like GigWorks, we're able to really develop plans to help you, accomplish what's best for your organization, whether it's migrating to SharePoint, upgrading, what have you, and leveraging some of those great 2010 features, and helping you maintain that platform coexistence so that you can make sure whatever you're doing, that when you do get into 2010, everything's just as you would like it. So now I'm actually going to switch it back over to Joe and let y'all finish up the slides there. And I'm just going to let you guys take over and share the specific content, because I'm not really sure which content to select for that. But thank you guys for listening in on the demo portion of today's webcast. And I know we'll be providing you with some contact information at the end if you have questions about our capabilities or what else AvePoint can do to help you guys with your migration project. So thanks for listening, and turning it back over to Joe.
Okay, thanks, Mary. Just to wrap this up very quickly, we're at 1:45. We do like to at least have 10 minutes or so toward the end, but just let's go a couple other things. Legacy systems as it relates to some of the opportunities around SharePoint 2010 in general. I had referenced the BCS earlier, and we really do believe that this is an opportunity to start to bring in a lot of other data from other line of business systems to refresh line of business systems. And then the DocAF connector, which, correct me if I'm wrong, Mary, this starts to play into the whole RBS thing, correct?
Yes, absolutely. So we give you the ability to connect file shares data through SharePoint without that whole migration process of bringing the content in and re-externalizing. It's just rapidly exposing file shares in SharePoint as a completely transparent SharePoint object and allowing your users to take advantage of the powerful capability SharePoint has to offer while not clogging up SQL, basically.
And this is the argument we very frequently make that in terms of competition, particularly to like Documentum and Interwoven and these other products, they really have nothing on SharePoint. In fact, it is quite the opposite these days, both certainly from a cost perspective, but from an infrastructure ownership perspective, and then the ability to leverage the other 5 pillars. So this is huge. And to, again, through third parties and through configuration, starting to deprecate things like Exchange public folders, search your Exchange and other line of business systems. Also, before I go on, I don't have a slide for this, but it was up front, one earlier question we got as to the advantages of 2010. There was a question about how I glossed over Office, which I should not have. Office 2010 in conjunction with SharePoint, this is slight to the side, but it warrants mentioning, allows you to do things like co-authoring, where you have more than one person working the same doc at once, something we do religiously at GigWorks. It's a huge efficiency getter for us. Office 2010 to SharePoint 2010, when you save back files, you're saving back deltas as opposed to the entire binary file, which is huge as it relates to WAN latency. And web apps, where the applications themselves, Office, PowerPoint, Excel, will run directly in the browser without the rich client. Yes, and so should you migrate data from legacy to SharePoint, all these things are driven by the value therein. So you can either full-on migrate or connect. We're actually pretty big on the connection versus full-on migration, but with enormous caveats. Certainly, when you have a lot of legacy .NET apps and Access databases, we would really there are a number of ways to elegantly, literally migrate off of them. But certainly, in terms of the connection to legacy systems at AS400, the common line for me is the business tier is great, the historical data is invaluable. The usability and UI, not so much. It's for stunken. And you really have a great opportunity to start to pull in that other data and resurface it, essentially, and mesh it up with other business systems. This obviously helps keep down migration and maintenance costs. If you bring stuff native to SharePoint, you get rid of that old box. But if that old box is otherwise running, you don't have to go through the migration. So like most things, like all things as it relates to IT, the business case, but there's an opportunity as it relates to SharePoint 2010 and the plethora of third parties that exist around it, that for the first time you really have a lot of options and choices that you can make as it relates to legacy systems and what to do with them as to a full-on migration versus connecting to. A couple of things. To migrate the data is now native in SharePoint. It's moved into SharePoint. You got rid of the legacy system. Burden of storage is on SharePoint, but certainly with RBS, those options now exist where it's somewhat, the storage is related to SharePoint but kind of off of it. And this is where the connector or the RBS connector comes into play. And you can migrate and decom those old boxes. Connectors allow you to view through SharePoint. The data is left where it's at. And you really can breathe new life into the systems. So migration versus connection, just in short, a lot of options. But again, I think the important thing to stress is you now have options. And these are options that just were previously essentially unheard of. For moving to SharePoint, some of the migration considerations on the pros and cons. The money as it relates to third-party tools, the additional servers, et cetera, and so forth, versus just the in-place upgrade, just to give a quick recap. But again, we think that particularly for those institutions who have been just chomping at the bit to get SharePoint right this go-around, the third-party tools are invaluable. Quick summary. know why you want to move to 2010. Now, this is something that obviously we're happy to assist prospects with. We have a lot of resources at gig-workswithane.com. And we do routine webinars to really move this value proposition from the abstract to the particular with folks. There are huge benefits to 2010, and I'm not just saying this in a sort of vendor myopic way. It was a big improvement over the product. And 07 was a great product, but 2010 was a game changer. Make sure that you have the requirements satisfied before you start moving this direction. Do you have the hardware? Have you considered that provisioning? Where is that on the critical path? This is something we run into with reasonable frequency. The decision to upgrade or migrate. You might want to upgrade. I would argue you always want to migrate. Not that you can't, but for the case that we had laid out before as it relates to downtime and business continuity and risk, migration through any number of the ways that we discussed, the bullets 2 through 5, we think are a better fit typically. And really to consider powerful third-party tools like DocAv to help this. And so one other thing too, in terms of the AvePoint tool set, and we'll happily send you a listing of the full product, and of course you can go to their website. But not only is there this migration to look at and the mapping that we just saw some demonstration around, but also as you start to look at those file systems and everything else. So knowing what you want to do long-term in a roadmap, not just the upgrade itself. The upgrade, it ties back to that first bullet. Why are you moving to 2010? Just because you're on an enterprise agreement?